We're now looking at Fauvism, about 1900 to 1908. It was a really short kind of um, art movement. It's French for wild beasts. It emphasized loose painterly qualities, had strong color over realism. They only had 3 exhibits. It only lasted for a few years, but it's bright, cheery, vivid colors, bold, distinct brushwork. And Henri Matisse is pretty much the father of Fauvism. He's a painter, a draftsman, a printmaker, and a sculptor. His father was a grain merchant whose families were of weavers. His mother was a daughter of long-line, well-to-do tanners. Matisse, while young, was kind of ill. As a child, he hated the winters. He didn't do so good. He was a pensive child. He was dreamy, frail, not what would you call very bright. As a young adult, he considered law as tedious. Nonetheless, he passed the bar in 1888 with distinction. And he did this really for his father's sake. Once Matisse finished school, he arranged for his son to obtain a clerking position in a law office. And Matisse discovered his true profession in an unusual manner. He had an attack of appendicitis, and he began to paint in 1889 when his mother brought him a whole bunch of art supplies. And he said later on that the moment he held the colors in his hands, he knew that this was his life, and he threw himself into it. Matisse's mother, listened to him, supported him with his art. So his drastic change of professions disappointed his father, but he would 2 years later, in 1891, Matisse returns to Paris to study art. It's a discouraging year. He's not very happy with the teaching style there. It's very traditional. He wanted to do something different. He was introduced to the Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, especially the work of Van Gogh, and he really kind of warmed up to that. He married his fiancée in 1898, 3 months after being introduced, and she opened a shop of her own making and designing hats. And in 1902, disaster struck. Her parents were disgraced and financially ruined in this kind of scandal that was quite national, and everybody knew about it. So thanks to his background, Matisse was able to organize his father-in-law's defense and get him out of trouble just about. So the ordeal took its toll. He was stressed out. His doctor orders Matisse to take 2 months of complete rest. His wife loses her hat shop. They lose their apartment. They're in poverty. And Matisse went through his dark period about 1902 to 03. And, he kind of dabbled in naturalism, but he went back to a dark palette and told his friends in 1903 that he had lost all desire to paint, and he just decided to give up. Matisse's career can be divided into several periods that change stylistically, but his underlying aim was to remain the same, to discover the essential character of things and to produce art that has serenity and balance and purity, as he would put it. Now, he disregarded perspective. He didn't like shadows. The distinct line and color is pretty much what he wanted to explore. That in the way of Cézanne, that pictorial space, the stroke by stroke, it kind of helped develop Fauvism, a way of seeing the world more as a feeling than with one's eyes. So the Fauve movement was not received well, and it went well under attack. He first exhibited some of his work in 1905 at a salon in Paris, and one of the biggest works that gave him the most controversy was the portrait of his wife, Woman with a Hat. this this led to a big controversy of Fauvism. She is overcolored. She has these splashes of paint here and there. It's all unnaturally placed. Now, this is his wife. It's featuring her with one of her designed hats. She's kind of twisted and contorted to see the viewer. It's not without thought. You know, these colors are placed in a complementary scheme. Where there's green, there's going to be red. Where there's purples, there's going to be yellows. Where there's blues, there's going to be oranges. So he meant for this to soothe the viewer through the color scheme, although for me it didn't quite make it. It was disturbing, especially with the colors of the face. So the critics did not like it, the public did not like it. They even called it like a nasty smear of paint. That's how much they hated this painting. Another painting that he's well known for is this Joy of Life. 1906, he draws us into this world of kind of a dreamy vividness of these composed little nymphs in this idyllic open field. You know, they're undressed, they're in pure color. There's these central outlines, beautiful line quality. Two women, they are lounging in the sunlight. Two more are chatting under the trees at the edge of the forest. You know, one crouches to pick some flowers where her companion weaves a chain of them into her hair. And this is a beautiful moment. A couple embraces with each other while another group engages in like a dance in the distance. So in this way, Joy of Life depicts these woodland nymphs engaging in celebration of their life, their womanhood, their sexuality. It had a mix of reviews from this massive painting. The shocking colors within the forest, the land, the figures, it was all a little bit too much for the critics to take. His Red Studio, on the other hand, it's oddly empty painting, very much red. We're looking at about 1911. It displays his work within the composition. Even in paintings that he was noted for destroying are featured in here because he would get mad at them and just and destroy them. So it's isolated yet contained in a room. The eye is supposed to wrap around the room of his studio in this kind of like U-circle-ish manner. You know, the grandfather clock without the hands, almost in the center of the composition. You know, the artwork appears in color and detail, while the room's architecture and the furnishings are indicated by this like negative gaps in the red surface. The Dance, another one he's well known for, 1910. There's two versions of this piece. The compositional study of the arrangement of the dancing figures is what's important here. The figures express this kind of light pleasure, this joy. The figures, they're not realistic. They're drawn loosely. There's no interior definition except for some lines of the bosoms. They've been likened to almost beanbag dolls because they're formless, and they have this kind of unrestricted movements. The bodies certainly don't seem to be restrained in any way, as they are very carefree. This appears childlike, but Matisse works very hard to make his paintings seem effortless. Imagine for a moment that instead of this childlike style, Matisse had decided to render these figures with that of one of the Renaissance painters. You know, would you get that sense of pure joy, or would it be too static? So he has a sense of play as well that's being expressed here. Joy, laughter, fun. It's just fun. And something that's actually very difficult to do is to simplify the form down to the barest and still get the visual expression across to your viewer. So he's learned these lessons of representation so he can create an image where form matches the content. So the dancers inhabit this kind of brilliant blue sky. on this green field. And did you notice that there's a little break in the circle? The hands of the two in front, the two front dancers, they're kind of parted where it overlaps the knee, but you almost don't even see that. So it kind of has this continuity of color. It suggests an invitation to us to kind of join in, and we almost want to because it's a very fun piece. We're looking at his Red Room. It's considered by some critics to be Matisse's masterpiece. This Fauve painting follows the example of the Impressionism, but it has this, like, with Impressionism, there was just like this overall lack of central focal point. You could find it better in Impressionism, but here in Fauvism, you really can't. Your eye is just everywhere in this painting. So it was ordered as Harmony in Blue, but Matisse was dissatisfied with the result, so he painted it over with his preferred red. He painted these flat areas of color rather than his characteristic thick brush marks. So Matisse emphasized this flat, decorative surface of the painting. Now, in April 1906, during a gathering at the house, Matisse was introduced to Picasso, who was 11 years younger. And Matisse and Picasso were kind of polar opposites, and especially in aesthetic values and lifestyle. Matisse was remarkably taller. He was more polished than the stocky, kind of cocky Picasso. The two are said to have always been looking over each other, their shoulders at each other. They wanted to keep in touch with what the other one was doing, but they're kind of like frenemies here. It's well known that after their rivalry, they were rivals. They grew, and sides were taken here. That Picasso later said that, no one ever looked at a Matisse painting more carefully than he did, and no one has looked at mine more carefully than Matisse did. This is probably very true. So one key difference between their pictorial concepts was that Matisse drew and painted from nature, while Picasso was much more inclined to work from the imagination. In 1952, he established a museum dedicated to his work, and this museum is now the third largest collection of Matisse works in France. Matisse's final work was a design for a stained glass window. It was his final kind of artistic creation. He died of a heart attack at the age of 84 in 1945. We're going to move on to German Expressionism. I know we talked about Expressionism with Van Gogh, but this is German Expressionism. It's going to imitate nature, but we're going to see these distorted colors. We're going to see this unnatural scale and space. It's for expression. It's going to express these inner thoughts and emotions. It's going to be direct, frank, and most importantly, it's going to be startling at times. It's going to have a direct effect on the viewer. And Max Beckmann is the one that comes to mind when you want to look at German Expressionism. And his stuff is featured at the St. Louis Museum, and it's just fabulous work. You must go see it. He made a total of 373 prints, all black and white, with printmaking a major focus between 1914 and 1923. He preferred this kind of scratchy texture of etching and dry point, but he would only make about 19 woodcuts. So he's 5 years older than Hitler at this time, and later on Hitler is going to classify him as a degenerative artist, and we will talk more about that in degenerative art, but I'm going to give you some background here just so you know what Max Beckmann kind of went through. So on March 13, in New York, Hitler opens this exhibit. It's about 1937. It's called The Degenerative Art, The Attack of Modern Art, and this was done with the Nazi Germany. So it's a major exhibit devoted to this infamous display of these artists' artwork that was confiscated by the Nazis. The term degenerate was adopted by the regime as part of a campaign against modern art. Now, Hitler attempted to enroll in the academy and become an artist. And so he has very many works out there, and he was rejected. And it's probably because of this that he was so emotional towards the modern artists that were kind of getting some fame for their work. Many works were branded as degenerate, and the Nazis seized them from museums, private collections. In a 3-year traveling exhibit that crisscrossed Germany, Australia, most were sold, lost, some presumed destroyed. But the highlights of the work included works of Beckmann, Klee, lots of other artists. The total number of modern works seized by the Nazis was over 16,000. The Beckmanns were a middle-class family. They were against his family objections. He applied to the academy. He would marry an art student there, and they would have a son. So Beckmann was under the sway of the German Impressionists. He painted stylish, kind of psychological, probing portraits. He tended to work in a very strange way. It's very odd. It's very disturbing, to say the least. So he wanted to produce this emotion from the viewer when he looked at this work. He's known for probing the human condition in his portraits. In the early 1910s, he worked as a late Impressionist painter, but it started to move past that. He would join the medical corps during World War I. He was discharged after a nervous breakdown in 1915. The conditions in Germany was intolerable. He fled to Amsterdam in 1937, and in 1947 he moved to the United States, where he taught for 3 years at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. So he suffered and from some kind of disease. He died after Christmas 1950. I think it was a heart attack at the corner of like Central Park in New York, not far from his apartment building. The artist's widow remember seeing one of his paintings in the Met Museum, that he was going there to see it. So this is The Night. It's created between the years of 1918 1919. Is an icon of the post-World War movement. We see 3 men appear to invade this small, cramped room where they kind of terrorize the scene. This is horrific. To the left, a man is hung by one of the intruders, his arm twisted by another. A woman, seemingly the man's wife, is bound to one of the room's supports after being raped. Not a pleasant painting. To the right, the child is about to be taken away by one of the intruders. And note the feet near the top right-hand corner. This is chaotic. It amplified the artist's use of color and form. The painting is limited to brown tones and these vibrant red shades. The painting is compositionally flat, with no real implementation of depth, but the woman appears at the forefront of the piece, and she's bound to the room's back entrance. It shocked the viewer. It's animated. It's a scene of chaos and energy, and one that you can't really get out of your mind after seeing. Probably his masterpiece. The Carnival, 1943. According to his diary entries, Beckmann created Carnival. This is probably the 6th out of 10. While he was in exile in Amsterdam between August 1st of 42 and December 5th of 1943. The art dealer purchased this directly from Beckmann in 1946 and then sold it to the University of Iowa that same year. It demonstrates this increased focus on brutality, agony, suffering. It expresses the disillusionment of this war-torn Europe. Beckmann differed from many of his contemporaries in that he experimented with abstracted figural forms. This triptych format has this religious connection, and it's and the first one was titled Adam and Eve. So he uses these Christian themes of expulsion, like being cast out of paradise, the fall of man, to kind of simulate his own and others during this time that was forced into exile from Germany by the Nazis' hands. So the carnival includes many symbolic references of these forced exile, such as these artists, they weren't allowed to do what they loved most, and that was to paint this modern art stuff. So they had to flee for their lives. We see the tension, we see the contrast, we see the opposites in here. The various narratives in here, it shocks the viewer, and it reflects visually in the painting. So we see these masked, costumed figures, some with musical instruments on a street, kind of like stage. It's reminiscent of an actual carnival, and yet that emotion of what he wanted to express is there. Now look at Modigliani. He was an Italian painter and sculptor. He worked mainly in France. He is known for his portraits and nudes in a modern style characterized by these elongated faces and figures. He's the fourth child, and his father was in business ruin, so to speak. And so at his birth, his family was in ruin, and the creditors were coming to collect, so to speak. And there was this ancient law. It said that creditors could not seize the bed of a pregnant woman or a mother with a newborn child. And so she's in the midst of labor, and these creditors enter the home, and she goes into labor. The family protects their most valuable assets by kind of piling them on top of her. So Modigliani had a very close relationship with his mother, but could you imagine that the personal assets thrown on top of a laboring mother must have been a horrific experience. He was homeschooled pretty much until he was about 10 years old. He had many health problems after an attack of pleurisy. About 11 years old, he later developed a case of the fever. When he was about 16, he'd taken ill again. He contracted tuberculosis, which would later end up claiming his life. He did recover from a second bout of pleurisy, and he went to Italy. At the age of 14, while sick with the fever, all he really wanted to do was see the paintings in Florence. And Modigliani was enrolled in the school. He was able to study a little bit, but then he was forced to leave again because of the onset of the tuberculosis, which is running rampant at this time. At school, he not only studied landscape, but also portraiture and still life and nudes. And he was pretty much a womanizer. When he's not painting nudes, he was pretty much trying to seduce female. So he was a penniless artist. He attempted to save face and try to maintain his appearance of money, but he lost. He didn't really have financial support. When he first arrived in Paris, he wrote home regularly to his mother. He sketched nudes, and he drank wine in moderation. He was a bit reserved at this time. He met Picasso. They did many portraits of him. Modigliani now is becoming a bad alcoholic and even a drug addict, and his studio reflected this. His behavior is out of control at times. He sets about destroying practically all of his own work, that's early work. he kind of gets this reputation of a homeless drunk and a bad drug user. So he's escalating in his intake of drugs and alcohol, probably to mask the tuberculosis from his acquaintances. There was no cure. Those who had it feared it. They were kind of, people stayed away from them. They were pitied. And Modigliani really thrived on friendship. And he didn't want to be isolated, and he didn't want to be an invalid. So he sought to suppress his coughing bouts and any other recognizable signs of this disease that was slowly consuming him with alcohol and drugs. And it intensified from 1914 onward. And while drunk, he would sometimes strip himself naked at these social gatherings. And he almost got likened to that Vincent van Gogh with his bizarre behavior. So after years of remission, the disease had reached an advanced stage, and he died at 35 in 1920. Not hearing from him for several days, a neighbor went to check on him and found him in bed. His girlfriend, who was nearly 9 months pregnant, she was inconsolable, heartbroken, and she ends up committing suicide by throwing herself out of the fifth floor window 2 days after his death, and she kills herself and her unborn child. Modigliani died penniless, and he only managed one solo exhibition in his life, giving most of his work away in exchange for meals in restaurants. But since his death, his reputation has soared, and now most of us couldn't even afford his work. This is the Red Shawl. The subject is his longtime love and partner. The young woman renounced her family and her Roman Catholic background to be with Modigliani, and the couple soon had a daughter. We see this kind of head cocked coyly to the side. The painting is done with such care and simple beauty that you can almost see, her through Modigliani's eyes. Here is the nude. The beautiful Roman woman, as it's also called, depicting this partially draped woman seated with crossed legs against this warm red background. The work was one of a series of nudes painted by Modigliani in 1917 that created a sensation when he exhibited in Paris that year. On November 2nd, 2010, the painting sold at New York auction for $68.9 million, a record price for an artwork of a Modigliani. The nudes of this period are displayed boldly, only with the faintest suggestion of a setting. So they're depicted with a degree of they're right there. They're right there in the front. They're the focal point. They're not, there's not a lot of form going on. They're not trying to do the form as if it was in the Renaissance. This is something totally different. It's more about how you feel about this person. So we see the female body. It's flesh. She is sitting to the side. The show was closed by police the day that it opened because people were saying that it was obscene, and they wanted it removed from the gallery's street front window. And so in 1999, the nude would end up selling for $16.7 million, a record, once again, for a painting by this artist. He died at 35 years old, of course, probably from meningitis and the tuberculosis together. And after he died in 1920, they crafted this kind of death mask after him, making 12 plaster molds for Modigliani's friends and family. Now, one of his good friends that tried to help him out, he was penniless, commissioned him to paint this portrait for his marriage, as a way of helping out his friend financially. And the double portrait is one of only three. and it only took him 2 days to paint it. And Modigliani made about 20 drawings on the first day. The next day he declared that the picture was finished. It was a modest price, like 10 francs, and a little bit of alcohol, of course. But Modigliani, he said it was done and he didn't want to paint any longer on it. He said it was finished. But his friend tried to help him out and said, keep on going. I'll pay you a little bit more. So this is about 1916. It's all on canvas painting, and it depicts his friend who was a sculptor and his wife. Okay, so this is who I normally think of whenever I think of Expressionism, and this is Munch. He was born on a rustic farmhouse in Norway, the son of a priest. Man, his father was very strict. His mother died of tuberculosis in 1868, as did his favorite sister. Get that up there. Sophie in 1877, and after their mother's death, the siblings were pretty much raised by their father and their aunt. He was often ill during the winters, kept out of school. He would draw to keep himself occupied. He received tutoring from his schoolmates and his aunt. He had poor health, but the strictness of his religious father, the death of his mother, and it was nightmares of death that constantly kind of filled his head all the time. So one of his other sisters was diagnosed with this mental illness at a very early age. The father tried hard to keep his family out of poverty, but it was too hard. His early drawings in watercolors depicted these interiors of different places that he had lived. And at 13, he was first exposed to other artists at this newly formed art association, where he was able to do a lot of landscape painting. He returned and started working in oils. In 1879, he enrolled in the technical college. He studied engineering. He excelled at physics, chemistry, and math. And the following year, much to his father's dismay, he left the college determined to become a painter. Now, his father viewed art as an unholy trade. His neighbors reacted bitterly. They sent him anonymous letters. They didn't like him pursuing this. So he's writing in his diary with a simple goal that, in my art, I attempt to explain life. It's meaning to me. It's for myself. And in 1881, he enrolls into the Royal School of Art and Design. And during these early years in his career, he experimented with many styles: naturalism, impressionism. Some works kind of follows Manet. Many of these attempts brought him unfavorable criticism from the press. His constant rebukes by his father was, even though he's angry at him for being an artist, he's still providing him with some money for living expenses. And at one point, his father destroyed some of his paintings, likely a nude, and refused to advance any more money for art supplies because he was just dead set against it. So because of all this and numerous experiments, he concluded that Impressionists did not allow for sufficient expression. He wanted to do something different. He found it superficial, too much to a scientific experimentation. So he felt the need to go deeper and explore situations brimming with this emotional contact and expressive energy. He started to explore within his own emotional turmoil, and he began recording his thoughts in this kind of soul diary. And this is The Sick Child, 1886. It's based on his sister's death, and this was one of his first soul paintings. A dark-haired older woman dressed in black sits by the child's bedside holding her hand. The bond between the two is established through the joining of their hands. They share this grip. It's typically rendered with such feeling and emotion and sympathy. It's intense. So we probably think that they were most likely blood relations, maybe his sister and the aunt. Probably. So some critics have observed that this older woman is more distressed than even the child who's sick. So it received negative responses from critics and from his family. They said that it was pretty much immoral, and only some of his friends defended him on this. So he continues to employ this variety of brushstrokes technique, and experiment with color palettes through the 1880s and early 1890s. He just struggled to define his style. In 1889, he presents his first one-man show of nearly all his works. And he's noted for how he uses color to convey emotions. That December, his father died, leaving his family destitute. He returns home, arranges a large loan from these wealthy people, and when the wealthy relatives failed to help him, he assumed financial responsibility for his family from then on. His father's death depressed him. He was plagued by suicidal thoughts. He lived with the dead. His mother died, his sister, his grandfather, and now his father. He wondered if he shouldn't kill himself, and then it's all over, and why live? So his paintings kind of follow that sketchy kind of tavern scenes, bright cityscapes. He experimented with pointillism at some point. In 1892, he starts to formulate his characteristics, and we see that here in Melancholy in 1891, which color is kind of the symbol-laden element here. He did an exhibit, and his paintings invoke this bitter controversy. It's dubbed the Munch Affair, and after 1 week, the exhibition closes. So he was kind of pleased with the great commotion that it caused, and amused that his paintings could stir so much within a person. Here's his Madonna. He painted several versions of this composition, showing this bare-breasted, half-length female figure between 1892 and 1895, and doing several versions of this. This is one I like in particular. It's owned by the Munch Museum, but it was stolen in 2004, recovered 2 years later. Whether the painting specifically intended the representation of Mary is to be disputed. So he uses it, he does this over and over again, and it has different titles to it. One is Loving Woman, this one is the Madonna. So we don't know if it's famous because of that religious connotation to it. He really wasn't known for being a Christian. So this unusual golden halo of Mary has been kind of replaced with this red halo, symbolizing maybe love and pain. The viewer's viewpoint is that of a man who might be making love to her. So this is an unusual pose. She embodies some of the key elements of that represents of the Virgin Mary. She has a quietness about her, a calm confidence about her. Her eyes are closed. She's expressing a little bit of modesty, but she's also lit from above. So her body is seen, in fact, kind of twisting away from the light, so it is to catch less of it, even when she faces it with her eyes. So these elements kind of suggest the conventional representation of the Annunciation. It was stated that the image portrays this kind of happiness and the pain in the act of love. Now, what he's most commonly known for is the Scream. And on Sunday, August the 22nd, 2004, the Munch Museum's version of Madonna and the Scream were stolen by a masked man with firearms, and the thieves forced the museum guards to lie down on the floor while they snapped the cables that secured the paintings to the walls, and escaped in a black station wagon. The police later found it abandoned. So both paintings ended up being recovered by the police August 31st of 2006. The following day, they said that the condition of the paintings was much better than they expected, and that of the damage, including a small hole in the Madonna, and they were able to repair it. Now, the Scream, done about 1893, was done over and over again. It is popular because the name given to it, it has different, so when you look at this, you might see different variations of it. It's because he did this over and over again, some in pastel, some in oil. You know, all of them shows the same thing, this kind of weird figure, agonizing expression against this landscape with this orange sky. So the Scream has been a target of several high-profile art thefts. And 1994, it was stolen, recovered, and it's also been called the Cry. First, it's so innovative because we have this first kind of indication of sound in a painting. He most likely painted this when he was about 30 years old. He painted it because he was extremely sad. His sister was taken to a mental hospital because of her bipolar disorder. In his diary, he wrote in it that he was taking a walk to go see her, and as he did, he was feeling very tired and ill and sad, and as he stopped and he looked out, the sun was setting and the clouds started turning this blood red. And so as the sky is being filled with all these colors, it was almost as if the sky was screaming, and the scream was passing through nature, and it seemed to him that he could hear the sky screaming. So he painted this picture that because of that moment, and he painted the clouds as this actual kind of like blood red, these brilliant orange and vibrant yellows. The color is shrieking, the sky is screaming, and this became known as the Scream. So he was reported to have died in his sleep from pneumonia at the age of 81 on January the 23rd, 1994.